Good morning and welcome back to Woodcraft of San Carlos. Today we're going to talk about, as you guessed, look at all the routers sitting on the table. We're going to talk about the basics of routers. Safety, the different router types, and also the different router bits and what they do. The most important thing when it comes to routers is obviously having the right protection. Most important, obviously, glasses. You don't want anything coming up off of the router and hitting you in the eyes. And your eyes are the most important thing you've got. So make sure you're always wearing protective lenses when you're using a router. Second thing, they're loud, and so we always want to use hearing protection. Very important. And third thing that's very important is a mask. There's a lot of dust coming off of these routers, so you want to make sure that you've got a mask on to protect your lungs from picking up any kind of sawdust. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to talk about the different things that you want to do and pay attention to with routers when it comes to safety. So remember that when you turn on a router, there's torque in the router, so you don't want to just turn it on and let go. You want to make sure you're controlling the router when you turn on the router. And then also, there's something called kickback. If you take a router and you put the router bit into a piece of wood and things aren't secured, bingo, it can come right back at you. So you have to be very careful about kickback. Like I said, dust masks are very important. The other thing too is that the routers do not stop instantly. So you need to pay attention to the router bit as it's spinning. When you turn it off, you want to make sure that you're watching the router bit as it starts to slow down. The other thing too is that the bit needs to be very secure into the collet. These are the collets. They come in, the router bits come with different shank sizes, and you want to make sure that the router bit is secured inside of the collet, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. Another important thing is that you want to recognize the direction that you're moving on the router bit. So when you are on the outside of the router bit, you want to move in a clockwise direction on the outside of the piece that you're working on. And then if you're on the inside, you want to move in a counterclockwise direction. Basically, you're going against the turning of the router so that it's cutting as it's moving. If you go with the turning of the router, that's when you can start seeing kickback. So you want to be very careful that you're going clockwise and counterclockwise on the appropriate cuts. So another thing too that's really great to do is when you have a very deep cut, like this one's got a tongue and groove on it. If you've got that cut, you don't always want to cut that all at one time. It's not a bad idea to make smaller cuts, shallow, and then work your way to the final cut at the end. And that way you're not taking off so much material and you actually end up with a cleaner cut because you're only taking off just a little bit when you do that. And make sure that any kind of clothing that you have, like a lot of people like to wear aprons and they have little strings hanging down, or you've got a long sleeve shirt, or you've got lots of bracelets or necklaces or whatever, or you've got long hair. Make sure all of that is secured somewhere behind you or in your apron before you start working, because the last thing you want to do is get something stuck in a router as it's spinning away. It could be very, very dangerous. And then the other thing is what's called climbing cuts. When we're talking about working in the clockwise direction and you decide, oh, I want to go back just a little bit, that's called a climb cut as you go backwards. Very dangerous. You want to make sure you're always moving in the right direction as you go. Back cuts can cause the piece of wood to fly out or get stuck, or there could be many bad things that happen. And you'll know, I call it the pucker factor. If you do it the wrong direction, the pucker factor is very high, and you'll know, you'll feel it. Your instincts are very right when it comes to going the wrong direction. So please be very careful when it comes to that. So we've got a couple of different styles of routers. The question is always, which is the right router? And the answer is, well, it depends on what your project is. What is the most common router would be something like a DeWalt makes a 618 router. This is a 2 1/4 horsepower router. Porter Cable makes an 890 router. That is also a 2 1/4 horsepower router. One of the tips I can tell you is that you want to be very careful about the router you pick because of the accessories that are available in the market. I see a lot of people buy routers that have, instead of a round base, they have an oval base. Well, none of the accessories out there will fit an oval base. So then they come to us and say, hey, what can I use? What can I do with my router? I want to put it in a router lift. Well, unfortunately, an oval base won't go in a router lift. Only a circular router will go in a router lift. So you want to be very careful about the router you pick. Bosch, Milwaukee, Porter Cable, DeWalt, those all make standard 3-inch diameter router bases that fit in the router lifts. And then you can go to the big guys. These are the 3.5 horsepower routers. These are beasts. This thing weighs 19 pounds. And the issue with this is the only thing you're really going to be doing with this above a table is probably Corian. Most people use these to route the edges of their Corian countertops at home. Most of us would take the motor out and we would put it into that router table we were talking about, and I would leave that 3.5 horsepower motor in the router lift all the time. It's a great router for doing big things, big panel bits and deep cuts with a 1/2 inch or more straight bit or something like that. So this is a great one for doing that kind of thing with the router table. This is a great one for doing everyday work. And then they go down in size. Then you can get down into trim routers and smaller routers. The only problem is that, remember I talked about, we're talking about collets, and with a big router like a 7518, it only comes with a 1/2 inch collet, and that's on purpose because if you put a 1/4 inch shank router bit in that machine, you could break it off pretty quickly. So you want to be very careful always using 1/2 inch router bits in a big machine. These guys come with both, so that now you can do a 1/4 inch or a 1/2 inch on these. The problem that you have is that this collet made for Porter Cable does not fit onto a DeWalt or a Bosch or a Milwaukee or whatever. So if you're going to buy in a family, stick with the family. I would not buy a Porter Cable and then go get a DeWalt, or a DeWalt and then buy a Makita or whatever, because now all the collets are different and the router bits will all fit in them the same, but the collets are all different. So now you're going to be spending all your time trying to find the right collet to go with the right machine. If you stick with the same family, then all the collets fit in all of the machines in that family. And then you get down into your trim router, and your trim router will only take a 1/4 inch collet. You could only do small router bits in that, and that's why they call it a trim router. And usually that router is 1 horsepower, maybe 3/4 of a horsepower. And so they're made to be very lightweight, and you can go around and trim edge banding or something like that with the trim router. Now within each of these, they have different setups. This machine has a plunge base on it. It's made to go into the field of a piece. You hit the little lever, and then down it plunges into it, and off you go. You can route inside of something. If you have a stop cut or something like that, that's what these are for. These plunge routers are fantastic for doing some kind of inside details. And then you have what's called a fixed base, and every router comes with a fixed base. The issue with the fixed base routers is they're not as easily raisable and lowering in terms of precision. So they're a little more fussy. You've got to work at it to get the router bit set at the right profile. Thus, again, like I said before, always get your piece of poplar, run your test around the outside of a piece of poplar, and then go after your nice piece of mahogany. So you're going to be spending a lot of time with your adjustment on your router to get it set to go up and down at the right spot. Then there's what's called a D handle. So the motor comes out of your fixed base or your plunge base, and it goes into here, and now you have a D handle. And this is quite nice. This is probably one of the best setups, is this plugs into the router itself. Take this guy, and you put it into the base. It clicks in, and then you go with your, tighten it in, and then click, click, and off you go, and you hold it with your left hand, and the D handle is triggered on the side. It's got a little button over here where you pull it in, you push the button, and now it stays engaged, so the machine will stay on. And when you're done, you push again, and off it goes. And now you can really get precise with this thing. It's very handy. It's a great way to control the router. I'm a big fan of the D handle. With Porter Cable, they make what's called an L handle. The name is a D handle, but it's really in the shape of an L because on the top of the L is a dust port, and you can draw dust up and out of the L handle of a Porter Cable. But it works basically the same way. It's out here like a D handle is. And so you've got your choice of how you want to run your different routers, and then pick the one that works best for the project that you're working on. And we're going to talk about that here in just a second. Okay, so a couple things to think about when you are using your router. is what is the appropriate router bit and what is its purpose, what's its profile. There must be 500 profiles or more out in the world of router bits. Some of the most common ones would be your straight bits, and I'll come and show you real quick a straight bit. That is a 1/2 inch, about 1.5 inches, 1.75 inches, 1/2 inch, just regular straight cut bit. And that's the same thing, but in a spiral. And they make spirals and up cuts and down cuts, depending on how you want the finished look to look on your piece. If you want to be pushing the edge of the cut down, or you want to be pulling chips up out of a mortise or something like that, you would use an up or a down. So those are pretty standard straight cut bits. And then you've got profile bits. That's a chamfer bit, and they come in OGs and coves and roundovers and all kinds of stuff. That's a dovetail bit. That's meant to make the edges of your drawers and things to give you that dovetail look. And that comes in all kinds, 7 degree, 8 degree, 14 degree, 11 degree. And then it has all the different heights as well, and the lengths across the top. So you can get dovetail bits in just about everything you can think of. So lots of profile bits. All of these that I'm showing you have 1/2 inch shanks. And that's usually the best bet, is if you're going to be cutting something and you have the ability to use a 1/2 inch shank, unless it's a very, very tiny router bit, then I would stick with a 1/2 inch shank. But these routers come with different size collets. This collet is a 1/2 inch collet, this collet is a 1/4 inch collet. And so these can hold the different router bits. And if you only have a 1/2 inch and you want to go to a 1/4 inch, there are inserts that can go in here that take that 1/2 inch and reduce it down to a 1/4 inch, so you only need the one collet. But if you've got the collet that's appropriate for the router bit, then I would use the collet. A lot of these machines come with both, except for the big guys. The big heavy duty ones only come with a 1/2 inch. So the other thing you want to be careful of is the bigger the router bit, the slower the speed that you want to run your router. And a lot of these routers have variable speed right on the motor themselves. And you can see it on these guys. There's a speed control right there. And if you run a straight bit, you want to run it at its pretty much its highest speed. And then if you're running a panel bit, which can get to be, sometimes they're about 3 inches across, you want to run your speed at just about the lowest speed that you can get. And I would highly recommend, I don't even know if there's any routers that you can find that don't have speed control on them, but always look for speed control. If it doesn't have speed control on it, don't buy it. Because you don't want to run a panel bit at full speed, because that thing only has one speed on it. And a panel bit, there's an example of a panel bit, and those can get to be quite big. This isn't even a big one. A big one would be, probably another inch wider than that. And for those, you need router tables, and we'll talk about router tables. One of the things you want to be very careful of with router bits is maintaining them, making sure that the pitch is removed off of the blades, make sure that they're sharp, that your bearings are working properly. Bearings are cheap. If you seize up a bearing, go buy another bearing. We've got lots of bearings here at Woodcraft. Or to keep them maintained well, they make a bearing lubricant that you can spray into the bearing every once in a while, and that'll keep the bearing moving properly. You don't want to have a seized bearing and then try to use that router bit. Best to swap it out. There are all kinds of different speed rates. So not only is there a speed, but there's feed rates, meaning that you want to move slowly on a router bit. Like for example, if you want to take a bit like a chamfer bit, and you want to take off a big chamfer, your speed rate's going to be very slow as you go around the outside in the clockwise direction, and then you move your router bit slowly in, until you take a big cut around that. So you want to be careful of your feed rates. Some of the things that are actually quite nice is a router table. So router tables. This is a Jesson router table. There are no end to the number of router tables. This is what's considered to be a floor model router table. They also make bench top router tables. They're just a little bit smaller. The fences aren't quite as complex as these are. This one has a miter set up on it for doing raised panel bits and squaring off. But Jesson makes a very nice router table. Craig makes a nice router table. Wood River, There's several of them out there. I mean, one I shouldn't mention the name of, but BenchDog makes a very good router table. There's lots and lots of them. And the purpose for a router table is typically that you are going to be using a large router bit. This is that panel bit that we were talking about before. Or we want to do some kind of a tongue and groove setup. That's what this set is for, making a tongue and or a groove. This is adjustable, so it can go up. These blades can go up and down, so you can make bigger tongues and grooves. Good example. That is a tongue. You can see that on there, and that fits into a coped groove on the other side. And so with these guys, we actually have a router lift installed into this table, which makes life tremendously easier. And what I can do is I can raise and lower the router bit just by turning the handle on this thing, and down it goes. First thing you do is you take your collet, and this one I've got a 1/2 inch collet and a 1/2 inch shank. I install that on there, and you slide the router bit in. And what you want to avoid is bottoming out the router bit. And so what you want to do is go down a little bit, go all the way to the bottom, and then pull back up a little bit, and then you tighten up your collet. This is a two-handed, so once you've got it in, that's it. You don't want to yank on it too hard. You just want to get it set in place, and then once it's in, now it becomes the point. This is the point where you lower this down to where you want your feed to go across the cutter. And I'll tell you what, you don't want to take your precious, precious expensive wood and run it across that thing without doing a test run first. You want to make sure that you've got the appropriate setting for the depth. You've got your zero clearance collar on there. That goes around the outside of the router bit. There we go. And then that is set up for the appropriate zero clearance, and then also it's set up for the height of the piece. So you take a test piece and you would run it across this thing a couple times to get it set perfectly, and then you go to your precious wood and off you go. Never ever ever jump into a router bit without testing it on something that's exactly the same dimension as the thing that you want to route later, not just any old piece. Make sure let's say you're doing something in mahogany and you've got a piece of poplar around, mill everything exactly the same so that your piece of poplar is exactly the same as your mahogany. Run your piece of poplar across, and then go ahead and run it on your router bit. And one of the nice things about these things is that you can raise and lower these things with micro precision. And then the fences themselves will open and close to the size that you need them to be open and closed. So if I release these guys, these guys slide back and forth to give you the appropriate opening of the router bit that's in there. And then you want to do your best to square it up. This router table has scales on the side, so you can square up your router table, your fence to your router table top. Get this all undone. There we go. And then you can see I can set it up so that it is to the size of the bit. And then once you've got it where you want it, you tighten this thing back down again. And now the opening is just wide enough to accept the router bit. And then once you've got it where you want it back and forth again with your test piece, go ahead and tighten down the fence, and now nothing moves. This thing's in the right position where I've got it up and down, and I can micro adjust to a 64th or 128th of an inch at a time, up and down. And then you get it set to where you want it, and then start the testing process, and then off you go. Beautiful. These router lifts have made life tremendously easier than trying to use the adjustments on the outside of these router bases. These are much more difficult to get perfect. This router lift makes life great. And what I like to do is I buy a router, I stick it in that router lift and leave it there forever. Never take it out, just leave it there all the time. Go get yourself another router. I think it was Norm Abram that said he had 25 routers. I mean, everybody needs 25 routers, like a hole in the head. But Norm kept getting more and more routers from sponsors giving him routers. Next thing you know, he's got a router for everything, and he would almost never take the router bit out for that router because you never know, you might need that thing again. So get yourself a good powered router. I would suggest like a 3.5 horsepower. Porter Cable makes a 7518. DeWalt makes one as well. I would put that router in there and just leave it alone, and then use your fixed base for other stuff. All right, so I have a little tip for you here. Woodcraft sells what's called Spaceballs, and these things are fantastic for using on raised panel bits. This is about a 1/4 inch little rubber ball, and if you see here, there's a tongue on the end of that piece. And what you do is, when you're making a raised panel in a door, a cabinet door, you put these in to the groove so that the tongue rests up against them. And what it does is it keeps the panel from rattling, and it also allows the panel to expand and contract with the heat or the cold of the summer and the winter. And so you put a couple of these, maybe 2 on each side, 2 on the top, 2 on the bottom, and that is great for holding it in place. But you have to plan for this. When you cut your raised panels, you got to plan for this. The other thing that these things are very handy for is bottoming out router bits. So when you put the router bit into your collet, people tend to put these all the way down, and that's not good. You don't want them all the way down, because that'll be harder to get them out. So what you do is you drop one of these little space balls down into the bottom of below your collet, and then put your router bit in, and it sits on top of the router bit sits on top of that space ball, and that's about how much space you need inside. So if I was doing this, what I would do is I would put the collet on, take my little space ball, drop it inside there, and then put the router bit in. And now I can feel I just got to the space ball. I'm not all the way down now. I'm about a 1/4 inch off the bottom. And then at that point, you go ahead and tighten up. And there you go. Your router bit is set at the right height outside of the collet. There's your tip for the day, Spaceballs. All right, one of the nice things about these routers is that they come with multiple bases, and they're super easy to take a router out and put it back in again. So what I'm going to show you is taking this router out, I'm going to put a router bit into it. And so it's super simple. On the back of these guys, you just release the motor, and look at that, it pops right up and out. And I want to put a router bit in there. So first thing I do is, remember the space ball? I'm going to drop the space ball in there. And then I'm going to take my 1/2 inch collet, put the 1/2 inch collet in. This is a round over bit, and it goes, and I can feel it bottom out on that space ball. That's great. And then this has a spindle lock. So I find the spindle lock there and then tighten it up with one hand. And there it is. That's as simple as that. And from there, you take this guy and you put it right back into the router base, lock it down, and then you do your setup to do your plunge. And down you go. You set it up for your plunge. And go. Okay, so one of the nice things about the DeWalt is it's got the same changeability as the Porter cable does. Right now I've got the D handle on. If I want to change it over to a fixed base, you just unplug the motor, release the router. It's got the adjustment on it already. And then I come over here, there's a pin on the back, and I drop it into here, and now it's locked into place. And I take the plug off of the base, and you plug it into the top here. And voila, you are ready to go with your fixed base. So these are really great because the switching is really easy, and then it depends on what you want to do with it. This also comes with a plunge base as well, and you can take the motor out and put it into the plunge base, and now you've got 3 different bases that you can use with the DeWalt. So some important things to remember about your router is that you do want to maintain it. I know a lot of people kind of just take their routers for granted. But one of the nice things, nice things that you can do with the router is keep the base nice and smooth. And what we tend to use is paste wax. It's wonderful. You use it on cast iron, you use it on all kinds of things in the shop. And basically all you do is just wipe a little bit of paste wax on there, take a paper towel, and wipe it off. And I mean, it's that simple. And just that little act will allow the router base to smoothly glide over your material, and it doesn't catch on the wood, on the material. And the nice thing is, if you wipe it off enough, that you're not going to get it into your project. The wax doesn't transfer into your project. If you weren't to wipe it off, then you could typically have a problem. Another one that's a great idea, I talked about it before, is router bit lubricant. You want to spray the bearings that are on those router bits to keep them in great working condition. Otherwise they could seize, and you've got other kinds of problems that go on with that. It leaves marks in the wood and stuff like that. But keep a bottle of lubricant around so you can just kind of give it a quick spray, wipe it off, and then you're ready to go. Now we get to the fun part. What kinds of things do you need or would you like to have with your router? One of the most important things you can do with the router is have an anti-slip mat down below. The reason for that is that you can put it on here and the piece doesn't move when it's on top of the bench or whatever it is you're routing on top of. These non-slip pads are an essential in every shop. You should have one. You can use it for more than that. It's also great for sanding. If you're going to use a random orbital sander or something, it keeps the thing from moving around as you're sanding. So that's a great one. I would recommend that highly. A couple other things that go along with routers are edge guides, simple edge guides. This is a more complex edge guide in that it's also a circle cutter. So you attach the router down here with the rods that come with the machine, and then there's a pin down below that allows you to use it as a circle cutter as well. And that's what this is. This is also a circle cutter. You would take your router and replace this base with the base that's on the fixed base that you've got, and then this guy has a pin. There's umpteen jillion holes. You put the pin in here to find the diameter of the hole that you want, and then off you go and you make your circle around. That's a great one. And they make these huge. You can make giant circles because this comes in much bigger than that. There's also the ability to make what's called butterflies or bow ties. And there's these router sets that will allow you to cut these out, and it kind of helps with cracks in slabs and other things. And it's very decorative, and so it gives you support in any of the kinds of those cracks, and that's a very easy thing to use with the router. This is a dust collection piece that goes on the bottom of a router. You would attach this to the bottom, and then you can see that the hose would rotate around along with the shroud, and that helps to collect dust as you're using the router, because routers are probably one of the most dusty things that you can use. Another thing that's really quite nice is if you're trying to do edges, this is a radius corner router jig, and what it does is on each side it's got a different radius. And so if you want to make it easy on yourself, you would set this thing on the corner and it follows that radius of whatever half inch, quarter inch, whatever the radius you want. And that just hooks with metal pins on the side, and around the corner you've got your radiuses. And one of the more important things are bushing guides. On the bottom of all the routers, it comes with a hole on the bottom that's perfectly made for these guide bushings to fit up in there. So if you're trying to do a template of some kind and you have a straight bit that's coming out, the straight bit is fit to the guide size, and then that screws onto the bottom of your router plate, and you're all set with router bushings. So another thing that's very, very handy to have. So I would definitely recommend getting one of those. So there's no end to the number of things that you can get. We have many, many experts here at Woodcraft. Our woodworking professionals down on the floor can certainly help you pick the accessory that you need, pick the router bit that you need. Again, there's 500 or more profiles here at Woodcraft, so come on over, take a look, tap the shoulder of one of the professionals out on the floor, and we'll help you get the right router and the right accessory and the right router bit. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for tuning in. Take care, everybody. Have a great weekend.